The wind howled through the Appalachian Mountains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the bitter promise of the harshest winter Montana had seen in decades. Thomas Whitaker stood at the edge of his property, watching the last rays of November sun disappear behind the snow-capped peaks. His breath formed clouds in the freezing air as he surveyed the small log cabin he had built with his own hands 3 years ago. Thomas was 42 years old, but the lines on his weathered face told the story of a man who had lived twice that long. His calloused hands and stooped shoulders were testament to years of manual labor, first in the coal mines of West Virginia, then in the lumber yards of Oregon. But those days were behind him now. After his wife Sarah died from cancer and his daughter Emma stopped returning his calls, Thomas had withdrawn from society completely. He had sold everything he owned, packed his old Ford pickup truck, and driven until he found this isolated piece of land in rural Montana. 12 acres of pine forest, a creek that never ran dry, and not a single neighbor within 5 miles. It was exactly what he needed, a place to disappear, a place to forget. The cabin was modest but sturdy, 20 feet by 20 feet, with walls made from logs he had felled himself. A single room served as bedroom, kitchen, and living area. No electricity, no running water. Just a fireplace he had built from river stones and a roof that kept out most of the rain. It was more than enough for a man who wanted nothing from the world. But now, as winter approached with unprecedented fury, Thomas faced a problem he had not anticipated. The old fireplace consumed wood at an alarming rate. What he had assumed would be enough timber to last through winter was now looking dangerously insufficient. The meteorologists on the battery-powered radio were predicting the coldest season in 50 years, with temperatures potentially dropping to 30 below zero. Thomas did the math in his head as he walked back toward the cabin, his boots crunching through the early snow. At the current rate of wood consumption, his stockpile would last maybe 6 weeks. The winter would stretch for at least 4 months. He could try to cut more trees, but the ground was already freezing, making it dangerous work. And his chainsaw was on its last legs, the blade dull and the engine sputtering. Inside the cabin, Thomas lit the oil lamp and sat down at his handmade wooden table. The furniture was rough, constructed from leftover lumber and held together with nails he had scavenged from an abandoned barn. Everything in his life now was about survival, about making do with less, about existing rather than living. He pulled out a battered notebook and began calculating again. Wood consumption, temperature predictions, caloric intake, water sources when the creek froze solid. Every variable was a potential death sentence if he miscalculated. The irony was not lost on him. Thomas had spent 25 years working jobs he hated, saving money he never spent, building a life that crumbled the moment Sarah got sick. The medical bills had consumed everything. The house, the savings, the retirement fund, all of it gone. And for what? She died anyway, on a Tuesday morning in March, holding his hand and apologizing for the cost. After the funeral, Thomas had tried to reconnect with Emma. But she blamed him for not catching the cancer sooner, blamed him for not having better insurance, blamed him for everything that went wrong. The last time they spoke, she told him she never wanted to see him again. That was 2 years ago. So he came here, to this mountain, to this cabin, to this solitude that felt like both punishment and sanctuary. As darkness fell completely, Thomas added another log to the fire and watched the flames dance. The heat felt good against his face, but he knew it was temporary. Everything was temporary. Warmth, comfort, love, life itself. All of it just borrowed time before the cold came back. He thought about the town 40 miles away, Miller's Creek. Population 312. He had been there twice since moving to the mountain, both times to buy basic supplies at the general store. The owner, an elderly man named Harold, had tried to make conversation, but Thomas had kept his answers short. He did not want friends. He did not want connection. He wanted to be left alone with his grief and his guilt. But now, sitting in his cabin as the temperature outside dropped below freezing, Thomas wondered if his isolation had been a mistake. Not an emotional mistake, but a practical one. Out here, if something went wrong, there was no one to help. No one even knew he existed. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Thomas pulled his threadbare blanket tighter around his shoulders and stared into the flames, wondering how many more nights like this he would survive. The first major snowstorm hit 3 days later, transforming Thomas's world into a white prison. The wind screamed through the trees with such ferocity that the cabin walls trembled. Snow piled up against the door, 3 feet high by morning. Thomas had to dig his way out with a shovel just to reach his woodpile. What he found there made his stomach drop. The tarp he had used to cover the wood had torn loose during the night, and nearly a third of his carefully stacked logs were now buried under wet, heavy snow. Wet wood would not burn efficiently. It would smoke and sputter and waste precious heat. He had just lost 2 weeks' worth of fuel. Thomas spent the entire morning digging out the logs and trying to dry them near the fire, but the damage was done. His calculations shifted again, becoming more desperate. 5 weeks of wood. Maybe 6 if he rationed carefully. The winter had barely begun. That night, as the temperature inside the cabin dropped to 45 degrees despite the roaring fire, Thomas made a decision. He would go to Miller's Creek in the morning. Maybe Harold at the general store knew of someone selling firewood. Maybe there was a solution he had not considered. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. The drive down the mountain the next day was treacherous. The old Ford's tires slipped and slid on the icy road, and twice Thomas thought he would end up in a ditch. But he made it to town just as the general store was opening. Harold looked up from behind the counter, surprise registering on his weathered face. "Thomas, you made it down. Hell of a storm we had. You doing all right up there?" Thomas nodded curtly. "Need firewood. You know anyone selling?" Harold's expression shifted to concern. "This late in the season? Most folks around here got their wood months ago." He scratched his gray beard thoughtfully. "Old man Peterson might have some, but he'll charge you premium. $200 a cord, probably." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. He had exactly $317 to his name. That would buy 1.5 cords at best. Not nearly enough. And he still needed money for food. "I'll think about it," Thomas muttered, turning toward the shelves of canned goods. As he was examining a can of beans, trying to calculate the cheapest possible diet for the next 4 months, the door chimed. A woman walked in, probably in her 60s, wearing a red wool coat and carrying a basket of what looked like homemade bread. "Morning, Harold," she said cheerfully. "Brought you some fresh sourdough for the week." Thomas tried to ignore the conversation, but the woman's voice carried through the small store. "How's that Hermit doing?" she asked. "The one living up on Blackwood Ridge?" Someone mentioned he might be in trouble with winter coming. Thomas froze, realizing they were talking about him. Harold glanced in his direction, then lowered his voice. "He's right here, Martha. And I reckon he could use some help, but he's not the asking type." Martha turned and looked directly at Thomas. Her eyes were kind but penetrating. "You're the one living in that old cabin, aren't you? My late husband and I used to hike up that way. Beautiful spot, but brutal in winter." Thomas felt his defenses rising. "I'm fine," he said flatly. Martha smiled gently. "Of course you are. But you know, there's no shame in accepting help. That's what community is for." "I don't need community," Thomas said, his voice harder than he intended. "I don't need anything." The words hung in the air like ice crystals. Martha's smile faded slightly, but she nodded. "Well, if you change your mind, most folks around here are decent people. We take care of our own, even the stubborn ones." Thomas grabbed 2 cans of beans and a bag of rice, paid Harold with crumpled bills, and walked out without another word. As he climbed into his truck, he could feel their eyes on him through the store window. Pity. That's what he saw in their faces. The same pity he had seen at Sarah's funeral, at the hospital, in Emma's eyes before she stopped looking at him altogether. He did not need their pity. He did not need their help. He would figure this out on his own, just like he had figured out everything else in his miserable life. The drive back up the mountain was even more dangerous as fresh snow began to fall. By the time Thomas reached the cabin, visibility was nearly zero. He unloaded his meager supplies and went inside, slamming the door against the wind. The fire had died down to embers. The cabin was freezing. Thomas added 2 logs, watching them catch slowly, and realized with cold clarity that he was going to run out of wood long before spring arrived. And when that happened, he would freeze to death in this cabin he had built with his own hands. Maybe that was fitting. Maybe that was what he deserved. Thomas woke up the next morning to find frost coating the inside of his cabin windows. The fire had died completely during the night, and his breath came out in visible puffs. His fingers were numb. His joints ached from the cold. This was only December. He had 3 more months to survive. He forced himself out of the thin sleeping bag and started rebuilding the fire with shaking hands. As the flames slowly came back to life, Thomas sat staring at the dwindling woodpile in the corner. 23 logs left. At 2 logs per day, he had less than 2 weeks of heat remaining. The radio crackled with more bad news. Another massive storm system was moving in from Canada. The meteorologist's voice was grave as he warned residents to prepare for extended power outages and dangerous wind chills. Thomas turned it off. He did not need to hear what he already knew. Winter was going to kill him. For 3 days, Thomas barely moved from the cabin. He rationed the wood down to 1.5 logs per day, letting the temperature inside drop to just above freezing. He wore every piece of clothing he owned, layered until he could barely move. He ate cold beans straight from the can to conserve fuel. His body began to shut down, conserving energy, moving slower. On the 4th day, driven by desperation he did not want to acknowledge, Thomas forced himself to walk the perimeter of his property. Maybe there was deadfall he had missed. Maybe there were standing dead trees close enough to fell safely. He trudged through knee-deep snow, his old axe slung over his shoulder, looking for any source of fuel. That's when he found it. At the far edge of his property, near where the land dropped off into a steep ravine, there was a massive hollow log. It had fallen years ago, probably decades, and had been slowly rotting into the forest floor. The outside was covered in moss and snow, but when Thomas knocked on it with his axe handle, it sounded hollow and dry inside. He brushed away the snow and examined it more closely. The log was huge, probably from an old-growth pine that had stood for 100 years before falling. It was at least 4 feet in diameter and 20 feet long. Most of the interior had rotted away, leaving a cylindrical cavity with walls about 6 inches thick. Thomas's mind began working, turning over possibilities. The wood was old and dry despite the exterior moisture. If he could somehow use this hollow log, maybe as a kind of chimney or heat channel, it might extend his fuel supply. He had read something once, years ago, about how pioneers used hollow logs for various purposes. But the details escaped him. He spent the rest of the day clearing snow away from the log and examining its structure. The more he looked at it, the more an idea began forming. What if he could position this log somehow to capture and redirect heat from the fire? What if the hollow center could act as a thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly at night? It was a long shot, probably a stupid idea, but it was the only idea he had. Thomas dragged his tools back to the cabin and spent the evening sketching rough plans in his notebook. He would need to cut the log into sections, seal one end, position it near the fireplace, maybe even create a series of connected chambers that would hold heat longer. The physics were rough and he was no engineer, but desperation made him creative. If you're watching this and thinking this man might actually survive, I hope you'll take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Sometimes the most desperate situations lead to the most unexpected solutions, and Thomas's journey is just beginning to take an incredible turn. Over the next 2 days, Thomas worked with an intensity he had not felt in years. Using his dull chainsaw and hand saw, he cut the massive hollow log into 3 manageable sections, each about 6 feet long. The work was exhausting, and several times he had to stop to warm his frozen hands by the fire, but he kept going. He dragged the first section back to the cabin using rope and pure stubbornness. Took him 4 hours to move it 50 yards through the snow. By the time he got it inside, his back was screaming and his lungs burned from the cold air. But there it was, a hollow log section sitting in the middle of his cabin floor, still covered in moss and dirt. Thomas cleaned it out carefully, removing decades of decomposed wood and insect nests. The interior walls were surprisingly smooth and dry. He positioned it horizontally next to the fireplace, creating an L-shaped configuration. Then, using mud and stones from the creek bed, he sealed one end completely. The theory was simple. Heat from the fire would enter the open end of the hollow log, travel through the chamber, and be absorbed by the thick wooden walls. Those walls would then radiate heat back into the cabin for hours after the fire died down. It was primitive thermal mass storage, the kind of thing that cost 7 cents worth of materials but might save his life. Thomas lit the fire that evening with trembling anticipation. He positioned the hollow log section so that its open end faced the fireplace at an angle, allowing heat to flow into the cavity without direct flame contact. Then he waited, watching, doubting every decision that had led him to this moment. For the first hour, nothing seemed different. The fire burned as it always did, consuming wood at the same steady rate. Thomas sat wrapped in his blankets, feeling foolish. A hollow log. What had he been thinking? This was desperation masquerading as ingenuity. But then, as the fire began to die down around 9 o'clock, something changed. The cabin stayed warm. Thomas stood up, confused. Normally by this time, with the fire reduced to embers, the temperature would already be dropping noticeably. But tonight, the air felt different. He placed his hand near the hollow log and felt warmth radiating from its surface. The thick wooden walls had absorbed the heat and were now releasing it slowly into the room. He watched in amazement as the fire burned down to almost nothing, yet the cabin remained comfortable. The hollow log glowed faintly in the darkness, its ancient wood holding onto the heat like a living thing. Thomas did not add another log to the fire. He wanted to see how long this would last. He woke up 6 hours later, still warm inside his sleeping bag. The fire was completely dead, just cold ash in the fireplace. But the cabin was still above 40 degrees. The hollow log, cool now to the touch, had released its stored heat throughout the night. Thomas had stretched 1.5 logs into almost 12 hours of warmth. The realization hit him like a physical force. This could work. This crude, primitive system might actually save his life. He immediately began calculating new numbers. If he used the hollow log system properly, he could cut his wood consumption by more than half. His remaining supply might last not 2 weeks, but 5 or 6. Maybe longer if he optimized the system. Over the next week, Thomas refined his design with obsessive focus. He brought in the second hollow log section and positioned it on the opposite side of the fireplace, creating a symmetrical heat storage system. He experimented with different angles, different fire sizes, different timing sequences. He discovered that if he built a hot fire for 2 hours, then let it die completely while the logs absorbed the heat, he could maintain livable temperatures for up to 10 hours. He became a student of heat, of wood, of fire. He learned to read the subtle changes in temperature, to feel when the logs were fully charged with thermal energy, to time his fires with precision. What had started as a desperate survival technique was becoming something close to art. But more than that, something inside Thomas was changing. For the first time in 3 years, he felt engaged with life instead of just enduring it. The hollow log system was not just keeping him warm. It was giving him purpose, problem to solve, a challenge that required creativity and intelligence rather than just grim endurance. He started keeping detailed notes, documenting everything. Temperature readings, wood consumption rates, heat retention times. He found himself wondering if other people might benefit from this knowledge. Hermits, preppers, anyone living off-grid in cold climates. The thought surprised him. He had not cared about helping anyone in years. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The massive storm system the meteorologists had predicted hit with full force, burying the cabin under 5 feet of snow. Thomas barely noticed. Inside his improved shelter, using his hollow log heat storage system, he stayed warm with a fraction of the wood he had been burning before. He brought in the third log section and created a triangle configuration around the fireplace, maximizing heat capture from all angles. The system was now so efficient that he was using less than 1 full log per day. His remaining woodpile, which had seemed so desperately inadequate, now looked sufficient. More than sufficient. He might actually have surplus. On Christmas Eve, Thomas sat in his warm cabin and realized he was smiling. Actually smiling. He could not remember the last time that had happened. The radio played old carols, and for once he did not turn it off. He allowed himself to feel something other than grief and guilt. He thought about Sarah. Not about her death, but about her life. About how she had always believed he was smarter than he gave himself credit for. How she had encouraged him to trust his instincts, to be creative, to not give up on himself even when the world seemed determined to crush him. Maybe she would have been proud of what he had accomplished here. Maybe Emma would be too if she knew. The thought brought pain, but it was a different kind of pain. Not the sharp, cutting anguish that had driven him to this mountain, but something softer. Something that felt almost like hope. Thomas added a small log to the fire and watched as the hollow logs around him began their slow absorption of warmth. Outside, the wind howled and the snow fell, but inside, he was safe. He had figured it out. He was going to survive. January arrived with bitter cold that made the earlier storms seem merciful. The thermometer Thomas had mounted outside the cabin window registered 18 degrees below zero on the worst nights. The creek froze solid. The trees cracked and groaned under the weight of ice. It was the kind of winter that killed unprepared people. But Thomas was not unprepared anymore. His hollow log system worked flawlessly, even in the extreme cold. He had refined it to the point where he could maintain a steady 55 degrees inside the cabin using just 3/4 of a log per day. The ancient wood seemed almost magical in its ability to hold and release heat. What had cost him 7 cents in chainsaw fuel to cut was now worth more than any electric heating system. Word of his survival began to spread in ways he had not anticipated. In mid-January, Harold from the general store showed up at his cabin on a snowmobile, bringing supplies Thomas had not ordered. The older man stood in the doorway, looking around at the hollow log configuration with undisguised amazement. "Martha told everyone you'd probably frozen to death up here," Harold said, shaking snow from his coat. "But I had a feeling you were tougher than that. What in the world is all this?" Thomas found himself explaining the system, something he would never have done 2 months earlier. He showed Harold how the logs absorbed heat, how the timing worked, how much wood he was saving. The words came easier than he expected. Harold listened intently, nodding. "That's the smartest damn thing I've seen in 40 years of mountain living. You invented this yourself?" "Necessity invented it," Thomas said. "I just figured out how to use what I had." Harold looked at him with new respect. "You know, there's at least a dozen families around Miller's Creek who struggle every winter with heating costs. Old folks on fixed incomes, young families barely making it. They could use something like this. Would you be willing to share what you learned?" The question caught Thomas off guard. He had spent so long isolating himself, convincing himself that he had nothing to offer anyone. But now, looking at his survival system, he realized he had created something genuinely valuable. Knowledge that could help people. Knowledge that could save lives. "I could write it down," Thomas said slowly. "The measurements, the techniques. How to make it work." "Better than that," Harold said. "Come down to town next week. Show people. There's a community meeting at the church basement. Folks would want to hear this." Thomas's instinct was to refuse, to retreat back into his isolation. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the warmth of the cabin around him, proof that he could solve problems he had thought impossible. Maybe it was the memory of Sarah encouraging him to share his talents. Maybe it was just exhaustion from being alone. "I'll think about it," Thomas said. Harold smiled. "That's more than you would have said a month ago." Progress. After Harold left, Thomas sat by his fire and thought about the invitation. Going to town. Talking to people. Being part of a community again. Everything in him resisted the idea. But another part of him, a part that had been dormant for years, was curious. That night, he pulled out his notebook and began writing down everything he had learned. He drew diagrams of the hollow log configuration. He listed optimal fire times and wood types. He explained the physics as he understood them. The act of organizing his knowledge felt purposeful, almost healing. 3 days later, Thomas drove down the mountain to Miller's Creek. The church basement was warm and crowded with about 30 people. Martha was there, along with several elderly couples, a young family with 2 small children, and various other folks Thomas did not recognize. They all turned to look at him when he walked in, and he almost turned around and left. But Harold caught his eye and nodded encouragingly. Thomas took a deep breath and walked to the front of the room. For the next hour, he talked about hollow logs and heat storage and survival in extreme cold. He showed his diagrams. He answered questions. And something extraordinary happened. People listened. They took notes. They asked intelligent questions that made him think harder about his system. They thanked him. An elderly woman named Dorothy approached him afterward. Her hands were gnarled with arthritis. "My heating bill last month was $340, she said. "That's half my Social Security check. Do you really think this would work in my little house?" Thomas looked at her weathered face and saw an echo of his own struggle. "Yes," he said. "I can help you set it up if you want." The words surprised him even as he said them. But they felt right. For the first time in years, something felt genuinely right. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas helped 5 different households implement versions of his hollow log heating system. He found dead logs on their properties, helped them cut and position them, taught them the timing and techniques. Each installation was different, adapted to specific homes and needs. Each one worked. People started calling him the Hermit engineer, though Harold insisted on the log wizard. Thomas did not care about the nicknames. What mattered was that he was helping people, that his pain and isolation had led to something useful, something good. Spring arrived in late March, transforming the Montana mountains from white to green almost overnight. Thomas stood outside his cabin, watching meltwater rush down the ravine where he had found that first hollow log 6 months earlier. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, and for the first time in years, the scent did not fill him with sadness. He had survived the winter, more than survived. He had thrived in ways he never anticipated. The hollow log system had worked perfectly through the coldest months. When April finally came and the temperatures rose, Thomas still had 11 full logs remaining in his woodpile. 11 logs that represented the difference between life and death, between giving up and pushing forward. He stacked them carefully in his shed, saving them for next winter, knowing now that he would be ready. But the logs were not the only thing that had changed. Thomas's phone, which he had kept turned off for 2 years, was now on. Harold had convinced him to reconnect it, arguing that people needed to be able to reach him. At first, Thomas had resisted. But when the first call came from a family 3 counties over, desperate for help with their heating crisis, he had answered. Word had spread far beyond Miller's Creek. The local newspaper had run a story about the Hermit who invented a revolutionary heating system using nothing but fallen logs. Then a regional magazine picked it up. Soon Thomas was receiving calls and emails from across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. People wanted to learn. People needed help. He found himself driving to different towns, consulting on heating systems, teaching workshops at community centers and churches. He charged nothing, accepting only occasional meals or offers of firewood. The work filled something inside him that had been empty for so long he had forgotten it existed. In May, something happened that Thomas had not allowed himself to hope for. His phone rang with a number he recognized immediately. Emma, his daughter. His heart hammered as he answered. "Dad?" Her voice was tentative, uncertain. "Emma," he breathed. There was a long pause. "I saw the article about you, about what you've been doing. Mom would have been proud." Thomas felt tears burning in his eyes. He sat down on the cabin steps, looking out at the mountains that had been his prison and his salvation. "I miss her," he said quietly. "Every single day." "I know," Emma said. "I miss her too. And I miss you. I'm sorry for what I said. For blaming you. It wasn't fair." They talked for an hour. Then too. Emma told him about her life in Seattle, her job at a nonprofit, her new apartment. Thomas told her about the hollow logs, about the people he was helping, about how he had found purpose in the darkest place imaginable. Before they hung up, Emma asked if she could visit in July. Bring her boyfriend to meet him, see the cabin and the mountains and understand what had changed her father. Thomas said yes, his voice thick with emotion. He would be here waiting. By June, Thomas's hollow log heating system had been implemented in over 50 homes across 3 states. A professor from Montana State University contacted him, wanting to study the thermal efficiency of his design. A sustainable living magazine asked to feature his story. Hardware stores started calling, asking if he would teach classes. Thomas agreed to some requests and declined others. He was not interested in fame or money, but he was deeply interested in helping people, in solving problems, in using what he had learned through pain to ease someone else's struggle. He still lived in the cabin on Blackwood Ridge, still preferred solitude to crowds, still carried the grief of losing Sarah like a stone in his chest. But the stone was lighter now, smoothed by time and purpose and the simple act of being useful to others. On a warm evening in late June, Thomas sat outside his cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. His notebook was open on his lap, filled with new ideas. He was working on a water heating system now, another way to use thermal mass to solve problems for people living off-grid. The radio played softly inside, and Thomas realized he was humming along. When had that started? When had the silence stopped feeling necessary?